Razeen. I teach international political economy at the London School of Economics, and I run a think tank in Brussels called the European Centre for International Political Economy. To give a sense of the mental atmosphere of the book, if you like, I have a quote right at the head of it from Henry David Thoreau, who says, not that the story need be long, but it will take a long time to make it short. Now, I tackle some very complicated themes, the globalization of the world economy, international trade and investment, the rise of Asia, the World Trade Organization, and so on. But what I've tried to do is to follow an injunction to keep it short and to write as concisely as possible for a broad audience rather than one of academic specialists exclusively. The other motivation is really to give these themes, globalization and trade and what have you, an Asian slant. I'm half Asian. I spend most of my working time in Asia, and I look at these big issues from an Asian perspective, given that, so everyone tells us, we are now in the Asian century. My IEA monograph, that's Trade Policy New Century, the WTO, FTAs in Asia Rising. I have four main conclusions, and to go through them in order. The first is that trade policy is very much disconnected from 21st century business and consumer realities, 21st century globalization, if you like. It's very much stuck in outdated 19th and 20th century ways of thinking. Just two symptoms of this. The Doha round of the World Trade Organization is mired in difficulties and largely revolves around discussions that are very, very far removed from on-the-ground business and consumer realities. Another symptom is the fashion for free trade agreements, so-called, all around the world, which are also very much against the grain of what business and consumers need. They're all about very discriminatory, very bureaucratic provisions that slice up trade at a time when companies have their sourcing from all over the world and have global supply chains. They don't make any sense. That's my first conclusion. My second conclusion is that trade policy depends too much on bureaucratic, sluggish international institutions, and there are diminishing returns to this kind of method to open up markets. The third conclusion is that there has been a slowdown in liberalization and reform around the world, and at the same time more market skeptical or anti-market ideas have become more popular again. Now, while this hasn't been that much of a problem in the last few years, because liberalization has delivered the goods, we've had very benign conditions in the world economy, it is now much more of a problem. The Goldilocks global economy has come to an end, which exposes the weaknesses of not reforming enough in recent years. And there are now protectionist responses to events and crises, such as the increase in the price of food and of fuel around the world. The bottom line is this: if there isn't a fresh wave of liberalization and reform in international markets, it'll be much more difficult to deliver the fruits of globalization around the world, particularly to people in developing countries. And also, it'll be much more difficult to contain protectionism, which does threaten to unravel the gains from the previous wave of reform. Final conclusion is a question: what needs to be done? My view is that there needs to be radical reform in the World Trade Organization, also much more caution with these free trade agreements that are proliferating. But most important, it's important that countries liberalize themselves, unilaterally as it were. This is the Nike strategy: just do it. Or as a defunct German economist put it, internationalism, like charity, begins at home. Not, I would add, in international organizations. So it's important that countries liberalize by themselves. China really is the country that will set the key signals now, not the West, and that there's a ripple effect through a kind of decentralized, bottom-up method of liberalization. It's important that barriers behind the border, as it were, complex regulatory barriers, are tackled in this way. And finally, I would add that it's important that trade policy should really be considered much more part of domestic economic policy and much less a plaything of international institutions. And it should be fixed in an attitude of domestic liberalism. In other words, part of the classical liberal package of limited government, free markets, free trade at home, and free trade abroad. Now, that's all very well as a mantra. The real practical question is how to turn it into policies and policy suggestions that are practicable, that are feasible.
Looking ahead, what are the main protectionist threats to the world economy then, and what do you see as being the key policy challenges?
Well, I think there are, of course, many short-term and long-term challenges and protectionist threats, but I'd boil them down to four key points. The first is the integration of China and India into the world economy, part of the re-emergence of Asia into the world economy. Now, what we are seeing now, given that China and India account for 40% of humanity, is the biggest transformation in the world economy, at least since the end of the American Civil War, with the entry of the United States into the world economy, and possibly the biggest transformation since the Industrial Revolution itself. Now, that promises huge gains around the world through specialization, through more open markets, but at the same time, it does promise much more protectionism, because the scale of the adjustment means that there will be many more protectionist pressures coming not just from the West, but also from other developing countries, directed particularly against China. Now, one response to this is what I would call globalization and social democracy. In other words, in order to keep markets open, governments need to intervene more at home and harmonize standards abroad. My response is that this is precisely the wrong way to go about it. What's needed is adaptation through a classical liberal package of limited government and free markets at home and abroad. Now again, that's easier said than done. It's got to be turned into practical proposals. Second point really concerns migration and the movement of people and workers across borders. This is very much part of free trade, broadly defined. It's not just about goods and services and capital, it's also about people. I think it's important to pursue an agenda of freer movement of people across borders, gradually, realistically, over a long period of time. A tough agenda to pursue, but it needs to be done. My third main point is that probably the biggest protectionist threat in the short to medium term is the agenda to limit climate change and against global warming. Now, this is already bringing about protectionist pressures, calls for carbon tariffs, for example. That is bound to get worse, and it is dangerous for the health of the world economy. It's a symptom of, shall we say, a broader issue of trying to regulate standards around the world. And this is very much a Western agenda of imposing artificially high Western standards on developing countries in particular, which do threaten their prospects for growth and poverty alleviation and so on. The final threat is from a combination of investment and energy nationalism. So we are seeing new calls to limit or control foreign investment, and it's very much concentrated in commodity, resource, energy sectors. Just a couple of concluding observations, big picture observations mainly. The first is that nation states still matter, and that what national governments do is very important alongside what we now know as globalization. And that's probably more important than any other instance or level of policy. Second observation following on from that is that what we need to complement what national governments do is not some kind of ambitious, I would argue over-ambitious global governance, but much more a realistic, serviceable multilateralism in the WTO and in other international organizations with realistic, perhaps more modest, goals and instruments. And I think the very final observation I would make is that what's really needed is what Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times, calls a liberal realism. In other words, it's important to pursue a classical liberal agenda in 21st century conditions, at home and abroad, but one has to do it realistically rather than in an abstract or a utopian sense. And that kind of motto or dictum of liberal realism is what I've tried to stay true to in writing the monograph.